Hi everyone, and welcome to this Multilingual Matters online event. I'm Flo from Multilingual Matters, and I'm delighted today to be joined by the editors for the Researching Multilingually series, Prue Holmes and Richard Fay, as well as Bridget Goodman and Brian Seilstad, who will be speaking about their newly published book, Researching Multilingually, Conceptual and Methodological Failures, Struggles and Successes. At the end of the event, we are going to have time for an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please use Zoom's Q&A tool to post those. My colleague will be monitoring those and she'll pick some for us to answer at the end of the event. And we'll also be giving you a discount code for 40% off all titles in the series, so look out for that as well at the end of the event. And I'll now hand over to Prue and Richard, who are going to introduce their series and then speak to Bridget and Brian about their book. Over to you, Prue and Richard.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us to hear about Bridget and Brian's book and to hear a bit more about Researching Multilingually and the book series. So I just thought I'd start by talking about what Researching Multilingually is. So it's how researchers use their linguistic and other communicative resources in the research process, from the conceptualization of the project through to the completion and impact. So all of the stages all the way through. It includes the languages the researcher has, but it's also the researcher's disposition and their positionality, and very much reflexivity vis-a-vis the languages in circulation. So it's not just the competence of a speaker in language X or Y, but very much the resources, the linguistic resources they have at their disposition. Note that it's not about researching multilingualism, which is focused much more on the study of languages used by speakers in a particular context, although the power and positioning of languages in the research domain, including those of the researcher, must of course be considered by the researcher. Talking a little bit now about how we came to develop the idea and then end up linking with the book series of Multilingual Matters. I led an AHRC project with Richard and Jane Andrews to explore the concept among researchers in areas of applied linguistics, education, intercultural communication, and other applied areas. And we published this work first in 2013 in a special issue series edited by Jane in the International Journal of Applied Linguistics. We went on to develop this concept further through Alison Phipps's large grant, AHRC large grant, Researching Multilingually at the Borders of Languages, the Body, Law, and the State. So Alison was interested in our concept and took the Researching Multilingually idea to embed it in her project. And Richard, Jane, and I led one of the strands within the project where we investigated researchers and how they researched multilingually. So the focus was very much multilingual, multinational, and multidisciplinary, because the members of our project covered various disciplines such as psychology, ethnography, education, applied linguistics, etc. So we were able to expand the idea of our initial understanding. And we came to realize that researching multilingually goes beyond the researcher's linguistic resources to include an array of communication that involves affect, creativity and creative arts methods, ethical ways of behaving and being in communication with others. And it also considers linguistic and other hegemonies and power structures that shape how language is used by researchers and others, or not, in given contexts. With all of this in mind, we approached Multilingual Matters to see if they would be interested in a book series. So we were really delighted when they accepted our offer. And since then, we've developed in the series. We've had 9 publications to date. And many of the ideas that emerged out of this larger project with Alison have been reflected in the publications. So we've been able to expand understandings of the concept of researching multilingually methodologically in terms of practice, ethics, and other dilemmas and much more. So through critical interpretive research and in contexts where languages are under pressure, pain, and tension, through the book series, you can see an array of different publications in different contexts, drawing on this concept and expanding it. Just a quick overview of a couple of the books that that got us going in the project and in the series. The first publication was in 2018 by one of our colleagues in the AHRC grant. Oh, sorry, no, the second one. The second one was by Robert Gibb, and then he worked with Tremlett and Denaro Iglesias to talk about ethnography. And so that was a really interesting way of developing multilingualism and researching multilingually within an ethnographic research framework. But our first book was Warriner and Bigelow, an edited collection where they drew on many of their PhD students to talk about critical reflections on research methods, particularly power and equity in complex multilingual contexts. And that very much addressed ethical issues. A third one by Facetta, Almazri and Phipps, again, colleagues in the larger project, looked at online collaboration across impassable borders, and that was concerned with Gaza, particularly engaging multilingually in online international academic collaborations. A further edition by myself, Judith Reynolds, and Sarah Ganassan, explored the politics of researching multilingually. So we were very much interested in the power structures and the linguistic hegemonies and ideologies that researchers face when negotiating languages in their research. We've also had research monographs. So Sarah Cox is a recent one where she published her research within our series, Meeting the Needs of United Refugee Families, an ecological multilingual approach to language learners. So very much the ecology, the multilingual aspects of the ecology, and how that influenced the way she drew on her linguistic resources. So that's a flavour of some of the books that have been published, and we're delighted now to welcome Bridget and Brian's new book into our series, and Richard will talk further about that now. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Prue. It's great to have been involved with this book and its journey over the last few years to this publication, and it's also great to actually now put names to faces and to see Bridget and Brian for the first time. So this is the latest book, as Prue said. It's here from 2025 publishing date. It's the 9th in our series. Bridget and Brian are the editors of the book. It has an impressive team of 22 writers, contributors to the chapters, 18 chapters in total. And I think some striking things about it. First of all, it's the kind of diversity of the perspectives on offer. So we've got contributors who distributed globally, from Indonesia to Fiji, from Kazakhstan to France, from the UAE to the UK, etc., etc. So it's a very geographically distributed set of contributions. It's also coming from a variety of different disciplinary homes. We've got people in sort of composition writing, literacy studies, language planning, foreign language education, TESOL applied linguistics, and more besides. The writers, the contributors to the volume, come with their own particular linguistic ecologies, their backgrounds, their own resources, and the repertoires and languages which are involved in the context and the phenomena they're researching. So it's a very wide in that sense as well. But what I like about it is that it involves researchers at different stages of their career as well, from people at the early stages and people who've been doing it for some time, in a kind of very respectful kind of dialogic way between those perspectives, which I think is kind of very, very helpful. In all the years that we've been looking at researching multilingually, I think it has the scope to surprise us all with the way it kind of manifests itself in different ways in different projects. And I don't think anybody has a monopoly on wisdom, and those different perspectives from different stages of people's research career are very, very interesting. The book title is also quite striking. I mean, we've got Researching Multilingually, conceptual and methodological are key words there. I mean, as Prue mentioned, we were very concerned originally with not just the practice of how to do it, so the practicalities, but also in some ways the philosophical aspects about why we should be recognizing, valuing, embracing the kind of linguistic landscapes involved in research, and in some ways challenging the hegemonies that are in place in many research contexts. And I suppose that's where the politics comes in. So we're looking at the reasons, why researching multilingually is so important in this world in which we live, with its linguistic diversity under threat. I was reading some terrible statistics recently about the likely reduction in world languages by the year 2100, and it was just truly shocking. And I think this loss of diversity is something which all of us in the research business, whether we're in sort of connected with languages as our focus of research, or whether language is just part and parcel of doing research, we all have a responsibility into that linguistic diversity. The book then has has its kind of subheading: conceptual and methodological failures, struggles, and successes. And I'm very struck by that. This idea of the failures, the struggles, and the successes. And I think this is something we'll come back to in the first question to talk to Brian and Bridget about that. I think it's so important, and all the work I do with my research training with doctoral students, for example, is to focus on not just the neat, tidy, kind of packaged accounts of research, but the kind of the messy, complicated decision making, the kind of and to use another key word from the book, wrestling with these complexities. So the book has got 18 chapters. It's organized into 3 main sections. It's got a section where we're looking at revisiting and reimagining the concept and practice of researching multilingually. We've got a section then which is all about wrestling with these complexities, and a kind of the final kind of keyword then would be embracing these things. So to actually see this as being a strength of research rather than a complication. I think that in my years of supervising research studies, it is a fact of kind of life that many of the committees that are approving of research see language sometimes as a problem, as an obstacle. And I really like the way that in the book it's talking about embracing these as positive aspects of research and not simply as complications, which is sometimes how they might be seen. Okay, I think probably that's enough from me, and it's time to actually listen to the people who've really got a very, very detailed knowledge of the book, Brian and Bridget. And perhaps we can start off with that idea of the failures, struggles, and successes, and sort of what inspired you to frame the book in those terms, and how you see it kind of working overall. I mean, are we talking mainly about failures and mainly about struggles, mainly about successes? How does it work in practice?
I can start, but I'll throw it to you because well, first of all, thank you, Richard and Prue and Multilingual Matters for your support of this project and working with us to see it come out in print. When at a certain point we got feedback from the series editors that raised some questions about the organization of the book and how decisions were made to organize the book into certain sections. And it was Brian who came up with the failure, struggles, and successes category. I think at least in part inspired by a chapter that had the word failure in the title and even framed failure as a concept of methodological research. I would, and that seems to have resonated with more senior scholars. It puts a focus on the practical issues and practical challenges of doing research multilingually, but also opportunities. And I don't think there's one that prioritizes over the other. It's simply, here are examples of times when the approach you take simply doesn't work, and we can learn from that. Here are times where people, like my chapter with Ainur, mostly we just talk about how we're struggling. We never completely resolve the struggle. We find some ways to address it, but still feel like we're working towards what people like Brian and Fiona Willens and Rajendra Prasad are doing, where they are able to go in with an open mindset to embracing their own multilingual repertoires and accepting when their repertoires don't match the repertoires of their research participants. So I think all of those are possibilities on the journey. And I think also some of the authors, especially the emerging scholars who describe their earlier struggles as new scholars, by the end of the chapter are able to look back and say, well, I do have a better sense of how to deal with this now. Like there is a way to overcome that feeling of anxiety, of struggle, and get to a place where these working in these spaces becomes more comfortable.
Yeah, and I think for me, you know, obviously when you're looking at a bunch of chapters and you're trying to divide things into some, there's a certain arbitrariness to it, and you do end up sort of forcing things a little bit. So maybe the failures it was a bit of a, not say forcing, but it was trying to be provocative in a certain way, because, you know, we're not, you know, that inclined to call things that we do as failures. And I don't think that anybody would read these as it's more like generative, you know, when things don't feel quite right and you're doing, or you hit a block, and plenty of the people talk about the blocks or the challenges being at a really theoretical level, you know, starting, let's say, you know, for some of the authors, starting at a PhD program, when you're coming out of, let's say, a TESOL or like a monoglossic kind of ideology about teaching and learning in certain ways, and then you're moving to becoming a researcher, and you're encountering things like heteroglossia, translanguaging, and those start to I've had that myself, you know, that starts to destabilize the way you think about language per se, and how you might think of a research project. But as you're transitioning and working through those things, you can run into some things that might be struggles or failures where, you know, you had an opportunity to gather data or to work with certain participants, and maybe you know, felt blocked in a certain level. And as you go farther, you know, there's opportunities. And I do feel like in the chapter that come in the end, the Jacobs and mine and others, you know, there are people who are creating those research zones, figuring out ways to work with a wide variety of participants when you are not necessarily of the same language group or background. Sometimes you are, sometimes you aren't. But even so many of the authors talk about the insider-outsider positioning aspect, which for them, even when they're parts of the communities that they're working, they still feel not so much a failure, but they feel a challenge. You know, they feel that this is not the easy, you know, it's just because I'm in that group, I can get everything I need. No, it's always complex. We were having some presentations here at my university yesterday with students who are, you know, at the undergrad, graduate level, and then, you know, and they're all working on these projects. And we were trying to get across the idea of being, as, you know, the more open-minded, the more, you know, respective you are of your own thing, the more reflective you are about your positionality, your skills that you have, and that you may need help, or you may need to rely on other tools, maybe multimodal tools. Maybe you're going to need to use a lot of things to get at people, because for many people, you know, at a certain stage, they're doing individual research, and that's part of the journey that we have as scholars. So we hope that the book is useful to a wide range of people who are reading, you know, either, you know, established scholars, but to, you know, early career scholars, and they find something in here that makes them not worry so much about an early failure or an early challenge, and they can work towards things that are going to feel more affirming to their work, and of course that of the people that they're working with.
Just before I pass over to Prue, I wonder if I can just follow up on that and be a little bit provocative in return. Do you think that the failures apply equally to the conceptual and to the methodological?
That's an interesting question. If I think about the authors in the book, I think there's one author in particular who had a conceptual framing that her supervisor framed as a failure. But for her, it was more of a struggle. She wanted to assert this framing and was not getting supported in that. So I think a lot of this, again, is about how you perceive the situation.
Yeah, and I do think that a lot of it does come down to some of those core ideas about what language is, again, and so many people come into things with a monoglossic perspective, and that's conceptual. And if that's something that's there, that's gnawing, it's not unusual that people have that, because that's frankly a pretty dominant view of language in the world. We were presenting yesterday, and I said, studying and working on language is difficult because everybody thinks of themselves as an expert. We all speak, we all have ideas, but when you really get into the details and read more deeply and understand language, I think at a deeper level, it does start to open things up a little bit. But if you're still working through that, and then you're designing a methods or a project, you can easily get hung up on what language should my form be, or what should my interview language be, and then you find examples of groups where the people are proposing questions and people are not comfortable sharing their views because they're feeling forced to speak only Chinese or only English, whereas in reality people try to really use everything at their disposal to make meaning together.
Absolutely. And another way to look at it, if we think about the Sing and Lee chapter, where they are revisiting Bourdieu's research with Seilstad on 3 languages in the Algerian context. And we could argue that they conclude that others in that context, in that time, failed to recognize the ways that local communities and local languages had to understand and reflect principles and practices of politics that others thought were only available or accessible in French. And Sing and Lee further go on to argue conceptually that you have to take a post-monolingual lens. You have to look at the relationship among different languages and the power dynamics among the languages in order to be able to draw those kinds of conclusions that may more accurately reflect the reality on the ground.
Prue, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, thank you very much for those explanations. And I think that moves nicely into our second question. You've started to talk about some of the key ideas and concepts in the book, post-monolingualism, ideas about translanguaging, but it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the content of the book, the theoretical parts and the other perspectives, the practical parts about the book and about doing research, the actual doing of multilingual research. And you've got some interesting concepts coming through. So it might be interesting for our listeners to hear a little bit more about how you organize these different topics like translanguaging, post-monolingualism, insider, outsider perspectives, comfortable languages, research zones, and critical sites of translation. And there may be other areas that you want to tell us about. But how did you approach this in the organization of the book? And then what lessons from both sides might readers take away from the book in terms of you as authors, but also in terms of readers as researchers?
Well, how much time do we have to answer this question?
Well, we've got a limited time. It'd be good to have some questions too from the audience.
I'll just say briefly about the organization, because I'm a Hornbergerian, so I believe in bottom-up approaches. That in the introduction, we highlight 3 key concepts that emerged, that came up repeatedly across the other chapters. And those 3 concepts were translanguaging, linguistic imperialism, and insider-outsider perspectives. And do you want to talk about any of those 3, or do you want me to keep going?
Go ahead.
Translanguaging, I think, as people probably know in this space, is the use of different repertoires for teaching and learning, but also we find can be used for research. Are you still with us? Okay. Linguistic imperialism, which is about the spread of English and the dominance of English, becomes relevant because English also becomes the dominant language for research, Although in other contexts, other languages of power, other colonial languages like Spanish in Peru or Russian in Kazakhstan or French in Morocco also become relevant in the tension between using or promoting languages other than English, other than dominant languages for research and reporting. And then the insider-outsider perspective, I think we've touched on already a little bit, but the tensions or struggles between, am I an insider or an outsider? I thought I'm an insider, but I'm treated like an outsider. So especially since the majority of our participants were doing qualitative or ethnographic research, came up as relevant.
Yeah, and I think that the overall, structure of the book kind of flowed a little bit from those main understanding. I think pretty much every author sort of brought those up in their different ways, and then maybe just to say a bit more about the imperialism, I think that was such an interesting piece because several authors talk about wrestling with English. They know that especially if you're an early scholar, they know they need to publish often in English, but how to work with that. We have the lovely chapter by Meto about do we betray our participants and our researchers and the languages that we're trying to work with by writing in English. And they have so many interesting discussions about that, and it comes across the methodology in terms of practical things, again, like the form, the consent forms. How are we going to approach an interview? How will I transcribe the data? How will I do member checking with the data? Do I do member checking with the data, and how in terms of language? How do I write up my results and present that in a way that obviously meets people's need to advance in their careers as scholars, but is still, respectful of the fact that the communities that they're working with are agentive and they have their own desires for advancement and so on. And hopefully the research is supposed to be doing things to make life better for people, or at a minimum, raise awareness about the different struggles, especially in our case of newcomer communities or migrant communities, or communities that might be vulnerable in certain ways, like Chinese students studying in the UK or whatever. I mean, there are different communities, and we all are trying to figure out ways to, I think, improve the experience of people being human in the world, in however that is. And language is such a key part of that. And so that insider outsider stuff, but it's tough. Everybody's trying to make things to advance in their own way, but represent and work with the communities that they love and care about in their own work. So it was interesting to see that, or the online chapter. We love the one on the computer mediated conversations in Korean. I mean, this is a situation where people are basically trying to get products, but people are still trying to connect and be sensitive to each other, and and make their own situations better in their own way. It was kind of fun in that sense.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a follow-up question there quickly? Just thinking about those three categories, theoretical perspectives that you mentioned, sometimes it's not always easy to squeeze things into broad domains. I just wondered if there were any other key concepts or ideas that you thought were important. Could they be subsumed within these three areas, or is there something still outside of that you would like to draw our attention to, in terms of how you went about organizing the book?
I mean, the other concepts that come to mind, and some of them you mentioned, emerge more from the practical aspects of doing research multilingually at different stages. So the idea of a comfortable language, which emerged in a couple of chapters. Do you want to say more about that, or do you want me to keep going? Yeah.
I mean, I just think that the comfort and the idea of a research zone, for me, towards the end, those were pretty powerful concepts. The idea that people should use languages of comfort when they're doing research, and that doesn't mean their mother tongue necessarily. It means whatever is going to work in that context, and especially in what they call the research zone, in an interview, in a focus group. There is a really important thing to create that space where people can communicate and express their ideas as full as they can, so that researchers can gather data that can be convincing and for other audiences.
but also the idea that you don't have to be fluent or proficient in a language. You don't have to achieve 100, quote unquote, 100% perfect knowledge of a language. As long as you, as the researcher or the participant, feel comfortable using languages for this particular communicative purpose, it can be useful. The other one I like is the critical site of translation, which came from the Researching et al. Chapter, where they were working with Chinese students in Arizona, and they thought simply because they translated the word essay from English to Mandarin that they had solved the problem of doing research multilingually, except they had first-year students in the university who had not written an essay. I may not be remembering the exact term, but who had not performed this genre of academic writing before in Chinese or in English. So the Mandarin translation had as little meaning for them as the English. It wasn't, translation alone wasn't enough. There was a need to unpack understanding of what this was, which I would argue, becomes generative in the sense that you start to see that this is an area where Chinese students may need more support, where you can learn from that disconnect in communication and report that as a finding that becomes a basis for recommendations of how to work with Chinese students in the US. I should say Chinese students who come directly to the US from China for studies for that purpose. Okay, I'm rambling now. I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you very much. Pass over to Richard.
I'm struck with this concept of the comfort zone, and it kind of reminds me of a researcher called David Boder, who was researching way back in the 1946-47. And as a researcher, he said that because language was so complicated in the kind of the post-war situation with people in all sorts of displaced persons camps and survivors and whatnot, and all these kind of dislocations, but also trauma through language. So he said it was his job to keep up. So he would use whatever linguistic resources he had to keep up with the with his participants in his research. So, for example, he had a long career, and part of the time he spent in Mexico. So he had some Spanish. So he used his kind of Spanish, which he had when he was working there, to communicate with the Sephardim from Thessaloniki in Ladino. So he was making use of his languages exactly for that purpose, for this comfort zone, to make them feel comfortable, even if that made him feel uncomfortable, which I thought was interesting. But that's 1946-47. So I suppose my question about that is that, researchers have been thoughtfully thinking about the role of language in research for many years. I mean, this is 1946 he was talking about, so it's kind of, long before I was born. Why is it, do you think, that in some ways institutions and training courses and the kind of research establishment is, and I think this is my impression, is so slow to embrace this kind of post-monolingual lens, this embrace, to use the word of your third section of the book, to embrace the affordances of languages and the linguistic realities of the world in which we live. I mean, we seem to be sort of failing to learn from the kind of the wise thinkers of the past. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think why are institutions slow? I mean, I think that's the fact that they're conservative and risk averse, especially, in the US when you're talking about IRBs and other things. And those can be, I think, challenging. But I mean, beyond the main question of the using your full linguistic resources to make meaning with people, especially in these complex environments, the Meg Jacobs and my chapter, look a lot at, how do you work with, refugee communities who are coming together, and they've all come to wherever, Ohio or New Zealand, and now they're at a playground and their kids are playing together. And I'd like to, we as researchers would like to know, what is that experience? But, it's hard to, as a researcher or even a group of researchers, to make sure that you can, communicate. And the only answer, I think, is based in that post monolingual framework, that you're going to use everything you have individually socially, and the third part, which I think also is a nice thing about the modern world, it's better than maybe 1940s, that we do have a Google Translate and a lot of, multimodal tools that can be used in research to make meaning. I mean, I my own thing, I use a lot of, with the participant I described in my chapter, I used Google Translate to sit and talk, and she would tell me things, and I wouldn't get it initially, but I had it recorded, and I went home and I worked on it, and I came back the next day, had a better understanding of what she meant, and we kept going at it, and it was a long-term, year-long thing. And Jacob says the same thing. She's sitting in a room with a bunch of people saying things that she personally doesn't understand, but it's recorded. She takes it to other people that know the language better and give her insight, and then she goes back to the communities. Those are things that I think, are pretty, I mean, it's standard research methodology in a certain sense to work with people, but at the same time, it's nice to know that we have a lot of affordances, especially when you bring in technology and more. I mean, we haven't even talked about, our book was written, before AI even started in, and there'll be a lot of other interesting things. I suspect that our institutions will be slow to go to an IRB and say, yeah, I'm going to go to my participants and they may speak other languages, so I'm going to use Google Translate to explain the consent form. And I suspect IRBs will be like, ooh, that seems a little bit too too fast and loose for us. Can we be? But I think we'll have to keep working on those kind of things to make sure that, again, we can do the kind of work that needs to be done to understand how people make meaning together, especially in these complicated situations where a lot of different people are coming together to make communities and make lives.
And I'll just jump in and say that I agree with everything you said, and add that if I think about my chapter with Ainura Mukhambetova, we find two types of scholars. We find scholars who are in English dominant inner circle contexts, who are themselves monolingual English speakers. And so they're not used to thinking about these issues at all. They're not used to being pushed to think about these issues in the way that we do, and aren't always ready to embrace it when we do try to articulate our viewpoints. And then you have my university context, which is highly internationalized, highly diverse. Our professors are, I would say the overwhelming majority are bilingual or multilingual, but they are where they are because they have accepted the hegemony of English for research purposes. And so they just accept that they must produce output in English. They must read texts and cite sources and theories that come from English-speaking global North contexts. And so one of the things this book is trying to do, and the authors in this book are trying to do, is try and push back against that ideology.
I think that's part of its great power for me. I think this book really is kind of a seminal text in kind of challenging that many of those kind of the conservatism that Brian was mentioning, etc. But I think, for example, in my university, which is once again is a highly international university, it's in a very, very linguistically diverse context, 150 languages spoken in the city, language community. So it's very, very diverse. But we don't have a language policy, and which is incredible. In 2025, we do not have a language policy. So I'm trying to encourage the university to develop one. And if I go into that committee meeting and I start talking about a post-monolingual lens, I'm going to see the kind of professor of kind of molecular biology glazing over. I think that is there a danger that we who've got kind of an interest in the great linguistic resources that we have in humanity, we're preaching to the converted sometimes. And we think about the conservatism of institutions. How would you make a concept like the post-monolingual lens meaningful and relevant to those kind of people on the committee who ultimately have the power to change things, but it's kind of outside their comfort zone? How would you make it relevant and powerful to them?
I mean, of course, I can only speak in theory. I don't have to put the bell around your particular cat. But maybe, if we can draw on biology and the ecology of language as a metaphor, maybe there's a way to draw on molecular biology or molecular chemistry. Maybe there was a way to talk about the imbalance of languages and the need to balance out opportunities to use language in the ecology, but put it in direct scientific terms that they can relate to. or asking themselves, what languages do you speak? What varieties of English do you speak? Sandro Barros and his colleagues have written about this, that even people who seem to be monolingual may speak in different registers of the same language. So the way that this professor would speak about molecular biology or molecular chemistry may be different than how he speaks at home to his family.
And I don't know if I have much more to say. I mean, I think this is a challenge of our time when you talk about appreciating diversity and access and belonging in the world. You know, I mean, this is obviously slightly under attack, and not slightly even. It's but I do think it's part of our work to point out that diversity is good and that it is supportive of healthy biomes. You know, like if we're going to appeal to our molecular, I think we know that, you know, a healthy biome requires diversity. You know, a forest that is only one tree is not likely to be a very healthy forest, you know, and it's not even really a forest. It's just, you know, something created by a company. So, I mean, these kind of things are, I think most people understand this at a certain level. It's true that a lot of people would like to simplify and would like everybody to do the same thing. But you know, those interests, I think, are serving other interests than you know, profit motives and other kind of thing. They're not supporting the interest of creating a healthy world, you know, a healthy world where there's a lot of, you know, possibilities for people to exist in different ways while respecting, you know, law and morals and so on. We want to, you know, have certain things to where people can collaborate and work together. But a diverse world should be something we're willing to, yeah, you know, push for in all of the ways it is, whether it's language or trees or microorganisms or whatever.
Prue, do you want to come back in?
Oh, I might just need to cut in here just because we do have a few questions queued up, and there might be a couple more, and we want to make sure we've got time for them. But is there anything you just want to wrap up, like a couple of minutes?
Let's move to the questions, and then
Yeah.
if we've got time, we can address the
Add
final point
anything at the end.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, no problem. So the first question we've got through is an anonymous one, and the person asks, what are the key takeaways from the real world examples provided, and how do they illustrate the complexities of multilingual research? Could you please give examples? If Bridget or Brian want to take that?
I mean, there are so many, it's hard to pick one.
Well, I would say I mean, when you're talking about the realities, is that people, when you're talking about having a theoretical framework that's rooted in, you know, heteroglossia, translanguaging, it changes the way that you look at how you would approach a research project. And I think it does create opportunities to be more open and more flexible, and to create those kind of research zones and languages of comfort. So if there's something practical, a message that I would say to people is that, like, translanguaging, these things help you not to be too nervous or too worried about these you know, unpredictable situations that may come your way in research, and rather to prepare for them thoughtfully, knowing that you may not be ready fully for something that might happen in research, but hopefully you have a stance, you know, like if we talk about the Garcia's translating, you know, translanguaging and having a stance, and then being ready to shift and to design things in a way that is predictive or ready for as many situations that you could imagine, but also knowing that you can't imagine everything. And I hope that gives people a little bit of, like, more confidence, basically, to approach more and more complex research projects, because things are complicated out there. And it's, of course, nice to research things. It's useful to come up with something very, very focused that you know you can do and so on. But it's, I don't know, maybe it's more interesting to imagine things that are a little bit more expansive, even if it feels a little bit scary.
I agree. I'll just add that I think awareness is important. Supervisors should be aware, collaborators should be aware, researchers should be aware, and can develop awareness that as they go through each stage of the research process, if they are doing that research as multilinguals, if they are doing that research with multilinguals, that they want to be thinking about what role language plays in each of those stages or languages, and realize that they have options. They don't have to only focus on one particular language in one particular way. Some of the best things in our book are scholars who are able to say, we use local knowledge, local theories, local terms as theoretical frameworks for our research. So empowering, especially younger scholars, emerging scholars, to know they have choices, to know they have power, to teach their supervisors and peers about the linguistic ecology and about the kinds of choices they need or want to make. Finding that agency is important and possible. And possible.
And possible. Yeah. So this next one is from Judith Reynolds, who asks, could you please say something about the disciplinary diversity within the book? For example, what spread of disciplines do the case studies come from? How might this help us to gain an overview of how researching multilingually is engaged with and or misunderstood across different disciplines?
I mean, the book has got a lot of other things. You've got like retrospective historical perspectives about Bordeaux and other sort of, and then there's also things, there's computer mediated communication. There's of course ethnographic work with different kinds of refugees. There's transnational work, and what else? There's so many. Really, I mean, obviously it's not everything, but there's quite a diverse group of sites, time frames, time scales that are being represented here. That is pretty fun.
I mean, I think broadly speaking, the researchers themselves, the research projects they're reflecting on fall under the umbrella of multilingualism, multilingual education, or multilingual research. So I wouldn't say it's transdisciplinary in the sense of branching out into economics or political science as I've been encountering here at the university. But there's definitely diversity in context and approach to different situations. So there's because some focus more on supervision, some focus more on translation, some focus more on member checking or on data collection. So there's a wide array, some focus on theorizing. So there's a wide array of conceptual and methodological issues that are raised. And I was very careful when we were designing the index to try and make it so that if students or researchers had a particular question about a particular aspect of research, that they could find examples in different chapters of the book that would help them think through those processes.
Thank you. This question is from Louise Rowland, who asks, I was wondering whether the concept of comfortable languages encompasses participants' comfort, but also the researchers. What happens when the researcher is less comfortable with the language of choice of the participant? Thinking about how translanguaging might be part of the exchange on both sides.
It's definitely for you, Brian.
Well, yeah, I mean, definitely both end. I mean, the language of comfort is coming from that idea that it was come basically from something, I feel more comfortable speaking this, but I'm also good here. And then it was also connected right to that research zone, like when you're trying to work with people, creating those opportunities for people to speak what they want to speak. And then, you're as a researcher, we're hopefully recording and able to go and translanguage or reach out to other people to, help you work through the meaning of what is being said. And there are a lot of nice moments in here where the researcher does not speak the language of the people in the group, and they may have started in, let's say, English or whatever language, but then the people in the group are speaking a local or other variety together. The researcher is cool with it, just, sits back, let people discuss. And there's actually a lot of really interesting insights that came from those discussions that the researcher wasn't in the moment privy to, but was comfortable enough to let them happen, not to enforce like a language policy in the interview or focus group. And then, to do the meaning making later and then come back to the group. It was nice, and I think that also has things to do with even pedagogy and so on, as teachers, when you have students or in other kind of spaces, how to let them make meaning together. And it's about, opening up comfortable spaces for people to make meaning together and share their insights about whatever it is. And as researchers, for you to be ready to take in what is there.
I think for me, one of the surprising examples of comfortable language, and I think it was from Sari Silviani's chapter, where she's Indonesian, she went to do research with other Indonesians, and the people who were participating in her study said that they would go ahead and speak with her in English, they were clearly comfortable in English. I think they knew that the researcher was comfortable in English, and they told Sari, it will be easier for you to transcribe and report the data in English. So there was simultaneously an awareness that the comfortable language doesn't have to be your ethnic or native mother tongue. It can be simply a language that you feel comfortable in and that you have this shared repertoire with. At the same time, the choice to use that language was associated with the hegemony of English for research purposes. So it didn't ultimately affect the quality of the data, but it surprised Sari and it surprised us in realizing that there are multiple possibilities and multiple ways to engage with language in research. And again, embracing that and being open to that, and drawing on whatever language or languages are comfortable to obtain the data.
Thank you. This one is from Tony Liddicoat, who says, I think one issue that we face in promoting multilingual research is the sense that some disciplines, i.e. hard sciences, have that knowledge is unitary and uniform, and so links between language and epistemology and sorry, it's quite a long question. And so links between language and epistemology seem irrelevant to them. I think that the work may be more than just arguing for languages and might be more about arguing for diversities of knowledge and then working to language. How much do you think your book focuses on the intellectual payoff of engaging different epistemologies?
I mean, I can't say that any of the scholars in our volume talk about doing research on teaching hard scientist academic writing. But I can just say from my own experience on other projects, that people who are trying to engage in that kind of work would be well suited to look at research on genre knowledge and on how different disciplines communicate in different ways for different audiences and different purposes. And Christina Tardy in particular, she and her colleagues have developed an enhanced framework for understanding genre knowledge that does include and consider the multilingual nature of genre knowledge communication. So again, the hard scientists may not be aware that it's there, but it's there. And again, you could say, we're not always aware of every atom and every molecule in every drop of paint on the wall, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just the question came from Tony. He's one of the great contributors to this volume, and very, very great colleague too. So I mean, it's I think that so much of this stuff is rooted in really that positivist versus positive framework, and I obviously that's a long discussion in the human mind. That obviously big people, Kant and others, it's something that I think we're always wrestling with is the reality that we have in front of us the only reality? Is it my reality, your reality? And, does whose matters? And I think, hard sciences maybe has a certain way, but I'm not a hard scientist, but I think there's even in that field a realization that context matters there, and that, experiments done in different ways have their own variables that need to be accounted for. So things are not usually as hard as people realize. And of course, I'm not even talking about things I don't understand, like quantum states and all that stuff. I mean, there's so many things that are going on that I think the big question is that we don't know everything. We are trying to understand the world as it is, whether it's physical properties and for us, the social properties. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, there was a gentleman who ran a thing for teaching young teachers, and he had this great line. He said, education is not rocket science. It's way more complicated than rocket science. And I think language and this kind of work that we're doing is totally in that vein. Why? Because languages change, people change, situations change. It's not adding this chemical to another chemical and such a thing happens every time. That what's going on now would be different tomorrow. It's always changing, and the world is changing. And I think our work as scholars of this world, the social world, especially the linguistic world, is to understand that that's the reality. And when you weave in, the broader arguments around, creating a world that is more diverse, that is more equitable, that is more inclusive of everybody, that where the world's resources are justly shared as much as possible, and all of these bigger questions, so that, that my perception of the world, your perception of the world, and hopefully that we all have a chance to have a life of dignity, and I think that that's what we're getting at. A lot of the authors in the book are talking about different people, different communities, even themselves. How can we create lives of dignity for people? And as researchers, what role do we play in, creating that world the better world that we would like to see for all the different communities that we're with?
And that was so beautiful. You said, I feel bad adding to it, but I can think of parallels. Yeah, that idea of by embracing these multilingual identities and helping people become, fully embrace and be embraced as people they are, that does have implications for hard sciences. If we think about the case of the Dyson hairdryer that is spread worldwide, what I've heard anecdotally is that hairdryer was designed by people in India for people in India. So if people are allowed to embrace their ways of knowledge and to trans knowledge, right, to blend cultures and understandings and forms of knowledge, it can lead to better science. It can lead to more effective science and technology for our world.
Thank you. I think we've got time for just the one last question, and this one might be also one for Prue and Richard. What advice would you give to newer scholars who are writing their research and want to be part of such books that recognise the importance of multilingual research, challenges, struggles, and successes in diverse contexts? I don't know if Prue or Richard want to take that one, or oh, and you're muted at the moment. Or Brian and Prue?
I can say something.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think from the discussion that we've just had now, we can see that researching multilingually is indeed complex. And thank you, Bridget and Brian, for discussing all of the complexities within the book and the different topics that your authors have dealt with, the different contexts, conceptually, theoretically, methodologically, contextually, and the multilinguality of the whole process. And Richard's example in his question about the university not having a policy, the assumptions that people make around this is the language we use in this context, in this institution. So there's a lot more work to be done. And so in terms of the series, it would be really interesting. We invite people working in the area to really contribute and build on these ideas more in the way that Brian and Bridget have. I think that their book certainly contributes beautifully to all of these complexities. It's going to be really useful for supervisors, researchers, people making decisions about conceptual issues, methodological issues, ethical issues, and that language is not just a finite bounded entity. And we can see that areas of AI diversity, disciplinarity, disciplinary diversity, how do we bring in other disciplines more in the series to consider how languages are crucial in our research. So that's a sort of a summary of what I took from today's session and also from your book. So thank you very much for looking to us, because I think it's a perfect fit for our series, and you certainly build on many of the things that we've discussed already in the other books. So thank you for your contribution.
Thanks very much, everybody. And we did have one more question. Maybe we do have time to just squeeze it in if everyone, just because there was only one left and I feel bad for leaving. It was just the one unanswered. So maybe we can just briefly respond to this one. It's from Fiona Smythe, and she says, I'm interested in participative research with young minority language speakers, Maori in New Zealand context, deaf in France. Do you have examples of how young people can feel more empowered by research with and in their languages? Participative research is a way of allowing their voices to be heard.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you want me to tell your story?
Well, I mean, I'm just gonna, I mean, I think that that's the good thing about, all, research design of this, when you really get far into it, I mean, yeah, you should be being respectful, and it's a really an amazing opportunity for young people who are both the participants to become really engaged in, making meaning. It can be a really, action research obviously has a lot of things to say here, but there's, I don't know, it's really, you can really have a lot to say, and the students even just, helping those students and those communities to tell their stories in a way is, can be really rich.
I mean, Brian's being modest, but in his chapter, he has a research participant who is able to communicate with him in Portuguese, and he's able to use Google Translate to understand, and there's a feeling that particular student was willing to tell Brian things about herself that she might not have felt comfortable communicating to other peers or parents at that time. So sometimes giving people a space to talk and talk freely is empowering. Or if you're an outsider, giving them a chance to teach you about their culture, and really what Nelson Flores is calling in another book, radical listening. Really listening to their experiences and documenting it faithfully is another way to empower them.
Great, thank you. Well, that's really all we've got time for today. Thank you so much to Prue, Richard, Bridget, and Brian for joining us and talking about the series and their book. We are offering 40% off all books in the series with the code RM40, so RM40, and that will be up on the screen at the end as well. And if you want to submit a proposal to the series, you can go on the series page on our website, which I think is in the chat a little bit further up if you want to find that link. Prue and Richard would love to hear from you, as would we. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.